Yo, welcome to Six Slayers, the comic signature show, period. I'm Mike the Six Slayer, chilling with Mark, the honorable villain. What up, fam? How you doing?
What's up, Mike? We got one of the biggest legends on our hands right here.
Facts. We have today on Six Slayers, Steve Englehart joining us today. But before we chat with Steve, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and please, comments. All right. Our next guest is a comic book legend. His influence has not only impacted the pages of superhero comics, but the big screen and television as well. For Batman fans, he's created the Joker Fish and Rupert Thorne. Green Lantern fans, he created Kilowog Yapoozer. The whole world knows about Star-Lord and the Guardians of the Galaxy, Shang-Chi, the MCU characters. Ladies and gentlemen of the Staff Snap, we bring to you the one and only Steve Englehart. How you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you guys?
Let's dive right on in. Steve, since it's your first time joining us, we always like to get our first time guests, get their comic book origin story. How did you get your first gig in pro comics?
It's actually probably going to take most of your show to explain that. I was hoping to be an artist. Comic book art was what got me into comics, not to comic book writing so much. And I went to see Neal Adams at DC and said I'd really like to work with him sometime. And he said, "Why don't you start now?" And I said, "Well, because I'm in the Army now." And he said, "Well, can you come up every weekend?" And I said, "Yeah." And so I worked with Neal for like 6 months, just on weekends, coming up from the Army. And then I got out of the Army, went to New York. The cool thing about New York in those days was you had to physically be there to do comics, which was inconvenient if you didn't come from New York, but it was cool because everybody who did comics was in New York. And so all the people that you admired and had wanted to meet, they were all there. And so you admired and you met them. One of the guys I got to know was Gary Friedrich, who was, he wrote Ghost Rider and some Nick Fury and stuff. He had the lowest level editorial position at Marvel as well. And a stewardess got murdered in the apartment above his. And his wife said, "That's freaking me out. Let's get out of New York for a while." And so he called me up and he said, "Would you like to sit in for me for 6 weeks at Marvel?" And I almost said no, because I was living way outside the city, but I thought, okay. So seriously, it took me 2 hours to get in on the train and 2 hours to get out on the train every day. But at the end of 6 weeks, Gary decided he didn't want to come back. And so he sent back a script that he was supposed to have written, but didn't feel like it. And they kind of looked around the office at Marvel and they said, "I don't know, you want to write this thing?" And I did. I mean, what the heck? So I wrote it and I liked writing it and they liked what I wrote. So then that led to more work over time. And then eventually that's my origin story.
Wow, that's fantastic. So this writing ability kind of came out of a coincidence, kind of a thing.
Well, my father was a newspaper reporter, so writing wasn't like a very strange thing, but I just never had expected to go that route. I was looking to do art, but I found, and I have found over time, writing is easy for me. I mean, it's not like, as a general rule, it's not like working a day job, I mean, I have fun writing and enjoy the process. So that was always in there, but I wouldn't necessarily have found it if all those events hadn't transpired.
So, Steve, I would credit you as one of the first writers to have continuous story arcs. Who makes those decisions? Was it an editorial decision?
It was my idea. And when I started, I had the unbelievable luck that Roy Thomas, who had become the editor, said to all of his writers, "I don't have time to micromanage what you do, so I'm hiring you on the expectation that you can do it. And if you can't, then we'll fire you and we'll get somebody else who can. And so all of us, Steve Gerber, Don McGregor, we were left on our own devices. And so it was sort of up to us to think, what would people want to read? The only two things Roy actually said was, you have to turn it in on time every month and it has to sell. And if you do that, then you can do whatever you want to do. So all those books from the 70s are the product of the individual writers deciding that this is what they wanted to do. And if it worked, then they got to keep being writers. And if it didn't, then they got replaced. It's sort of unbelievable that, this comics were only comics in those days. And so, when Roy came to me and said, here, write Captain America, do whatever you want to do with it. That would never happen today, right? Because it's a major merchandising IP. But it was only for comics. Tried to think of stuff that people would be interested in reading, and that's how we got to where we are.
You created Shang-Chi and worked on Doctor Strange. And you mentioned in the 70s, these were Bronze Age characters. The cultural landscape was different back then.
Right.
What research went into creating Shang-Chi and writing Doctor Strange?
I'll start with Doctor Strange because he was the oldest character. When I took it over, Frank Brunner had asked for me to write it. Frank had been drawing it, but he wasn't happy with the writer that he had, and that writer left, and Frank asked for me. I had written Doctor Strange in the Defenders as he was a magician, but it was sort of a superhero group. So he did stuff to further fighting the bad guys, whatever. When I got his own book, I thought, well, this guy's supposed to be the Sorcerer Supreme. He's supposed to know all sorts of stuff that you and I don't know. There's a challenge for a writer to write stuff that I don't know. So I went down to a bookstore in New York, a big, famous occult bookstore of the time, Weiser's. It's out of business now, but and I just went in and I said, what do I need to know? I mean, give me stuff that I can work with here, right? And they gave me stuff on tarot and astrology and whatever. And I went and read all that stuff and sort of then tried to get the magical mindset so that I could make use of it again in a story. I wasn't writing a magical book per se, but I was writing about a magical guy. As far as Shang-Chi goes, Jim Starlin and I saw the second episode of the 3-episode tryout for the TV show Kung Fu. And we really liked the show a lot. And I was, having written Doctor Strange and having gotten into the whole Western magic thing, I was intrigued by the Eastern philosophy thing. It wasn't magic, but it was, the more Kung Fu, excuse me, philosopher concept. And so I wanted to write this sort of meditative, calm character who fights people. And Starlin, I think, he was interested in that as well, but I think he also could see, obviously, the artistic possibilities of Kung Fu. And so when they made the recent movie, there was a lot of talk about how, it wasn't Asian guys who created this guy. But on the other hand, there weren't any Asian guys, right? I mean, so if it hadn't been for two white guys, that character wouldn't have come into being. You can parse that however you want. But my original idea was to do a bi-monthly book, as I say, sort of the philosophy overriding everything. And we went to Marvel, and Starlin and I, and we said, we want to do this book about this character that we, have built. And Marvel was not interested at all. They, it's like, no, they don't know. Why would you want to see that? But we had enough clout, Starlin and me, to kind of get them to go, well, all right. So they put it in special Marvel edition number 16 or whatever after all the reprint books. And our first issue came out, and right after that, the whole Kung Fu explosion happened in the 70s, right? We didn't cause it. We were maybe surfing the wave a little ahead of everybody else, but I mean, we were just sort of standing there with our little bi-monthly book when all of a sudden Marvel wanted lots of Kung Fu stuff, you know? Let's make it monthly, and let's create Iron Fist, and let's do a black and white book. And so that chased Starlin off after 3 issues, and it chased me off after 5 and a couple of the black and white stories. We couldn't do the book that we wanted to do. But there's a happy ending to that in that Doug Mensch and Paul DeLacy took the book over. And if you look at their stuff, they spent like most of a year kind of trying to figure out what it was they wanted to do. And then they figured it out. And then it became the whole James Bond world thing. And after DeLacy, he had Gene Day and the other day, I forget. But I mean, Master of Kung Fu became this really classic series by becoming something completely different from what Starlin and I, wanted it to be.
Steve, Todd McFarlane has mentioned several times that you made the life-changing phone call that he'd been waiting for, when you hired him. What did you see in the young Todd McFarlane when you hired him?
Well, his art was primitive compared to what it became, but it was, he had a style and a viewpoint and so forth. So yeah, I liked what I saw. And one thing about doing comics with new guys is you see them developed. I mean, my go-to anecdote for that is when I did the Avengers and George Perez came on, and you could see in those Avengers issues George getting better month by month as he learned more about what he was doing, and a lot of guys do that, and I could see the potential there for Todd. He's not the only one. People getting into the business are kind of in awe of the business, and then after you're in the business for a while, then you are the business. So then you're not, you're not quite as in awe of everything anymore. And obviously the whole Spawn and Image and everything else. I mean, it exploded from the beginning. But in the beginning, I just saw somebody that I thought this guy could be good, and let's, the only way he's going to get good is to have some work. So let's see what happens.
Steve, you've brought back classic Golden Age characters and brought them back into the Bronze Age, or Silver Age characters as well, like Hugo Strange, Deadshot, Guy Gardner, Patsy Walker, Manhunter. Was it the appreciation for the publication history that made you want to bring these characters back, or was it, once again, an editorial decision?
No, again, my decisions. I just, when I got into comics, Marvel was just 10 years old, and DC, if you want to go back to Justice League and stuff like that, might have been 15, but there was a history, and I appreciated the history. I mean, those were the things that I was reading when I was deciding that I liked comics. And also, I mean, the whole industry in the 70s was only 30 years old. I mean, it all started in the 40s, right? So it was, and again, going to New York, I could hang out with guys like Wally Wood and Bill Everett and people that I, that were older, but I admired. So all in all, I just, felt a sort of gratitude, I guess, toward comics history and wanted to kind of keep it alive. The other thing was Marvel was 10 years old, which meant that continuity still existed. The Avengers that I was writing were the same Avengers that Roy had written, the same Avengers that Stan had written. They hadn't been retconned. They hadn't turned into anybody else. They were the same guys. And so they had a history, and Stan had started the whole continuity thing, which I thought was very cool. It kind of made the world realer to be able to refer to something that had happened. So all in all, I just, I was into that. And so, like when I got involved in Batman, I really thought they'd reprinted every once in a while an annual some of the really early Batman stories. And I thought there was a real feeling to them that had been lost, completely lost. DC had become so corporate and monolithic that all their characters were pretty bland, and Batman should not be bland, right? So DC had a library where they kept everything they'd ever printed as hardbound books, and I said, I want to read the first 2 years of Detective Comics and see what that is. They were kind of surprised because nobody ever asked to get into the archives. But I did, and so I read the early ones, and there was Hugo Strange and his monsters, and there was a lot of blackness, a lot of ink, a lot of shadows. I mean, they were bankrupting the ink companies printing those early Batman stories, so I wanted to bring back that pulp darkness thing, but I always want to do something new as well. I mean, I wanted to explore Bruce Wayne as a person, which is where Silver St. Cloud came in, but the crazy Joker came from the 40s, I mean, it's just but how do I put that together into something that hopefully makes sense in and of itself? So I love continuity, but I also understand that now that we're 60 years in or 80 years in, depending on how you want to count it, you can't be saying, well, go check out Fantastic Four number 14 in order to see, what's happening. So I regret it, but I understand that, can't do that anymore. But it was just, part of making the world seem real, making all these worlds seem like they actually had some validity. One problem with that, you mentioned in the intro that, I created Kilowog, Joe Staten and I created Kilowog. We also created Guy Gardner, but DC won't give us any credit for Guy Gardner because I named him for a guy who had pre-existed, right? And so their theory is Guy Gardner was created, as a one-shot character back in the 60s, and if we owe anybody any money or credit, it's the guys who created them, and they happen to be dead, so, we don't have to pay anybody. The fact that our Guy Gardner is a completely different take on what that character had been means nothing to them. I was talking to Steve Epting recently. He, helped turn Bucky Barnes into the Winter Soldier. Marvel pays for that. Marvel gives credit for that because the Winter Soldier is a different character. DC does not, and so that's one of the problems of trying to create a coherent universe. If I had named that guy Joe Smith, we would get money and credit for it, but that wasn't my choice.
You're alluding to something. It's making me want to ask this follow-up question because you mentioned that you read comics obviously before you started off in the comic book industry, and we heard a lot of stories from people like Jim Shooter and Marv Wolfman about how that generation of comic book creators were the first generation of comic book fans that had an opportunity to create comics. Can you shed more light on that?
Well, I think that's true. I mean, we were all of us guys who came into the 70s were fans. Primarily Marvel fans. There were some DC fans who, also came around, but again, DC, not to spend the whole time ragging on them, but Marvel was a group of people who liked comic books doing comic books. DC was a publishing house who hired people to turn out product. And, Murphy Anderson, Kurt Swan, Gardner Fox, all these guys, they were good guys, but they weren't doing it because they, were totally in love with the medium. I mean, they might have become so, but it was primarily a gig, right? I mean, it was something that they could do. So the people before us, I mean, I can't speak to Marvel. Joe Maneely and people who were big in the 50s at Marvel. He was dead by the time I got there, so I don't know, I don't know what his deal was. But I think a lot of comics had been gig. You know, you could get work drawing stuff and telling stories, and there you were. But those of us who came in as fans came in already loving comics and sort of not, I mean, we didn't think particularly about, is this going to support us in our old age, you know, or anything like that. It was just like, hey, we get to do comics. That'll be fun. Let's do that. We certainly had no idea that there would be blockbuster MCU movies, and we'd be talking about things like credit and money later on, because none of that, it didn't exist. It wasn't even considered. Right. I mean, nobody, you know, if you've ever seen the comic book movies from the 70s, the Captain America ones and the Doctor Strange ones, I mean, they're pretty lame. And that was one of the things that I hoped that I was able to change with the Batman movie, of, you know, like, this is actually something you can get interested in. You know, it's not something where you have to have the funny sidekick to kind of continually point out that it's really just a comic, you know, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
So, you know, obviously Stan Lee thought he could somehow turn that into movies, and he went out to LA, and eventually he did, you know, but the rest of us, we weren't thinking about that stuff at all.
So Steve, keeping on that same idea of comic book adaptations, how do you feel overall about the ending product of comic book adaptations that have adapted some of the characters that you've created or worked on?
It's a mixed bag. I generally like the MCU movies. So any criticisms I have are in that context, that in general, I'm good with it. You know, but the Mantis, I like the Mantis on screen, Pomplamentieff. I like the Guardians movies, but it's not Mantis, right? It's not the Mantis that I created. So I've said so, you know, that's like, it's too bad they didn't use the real one, but the one they did come up with, I like it, and I like the context. Shang-Chi, I got no problems with. Star-Lord, I have no problems with. It is weird sometimes. One thing Marvel is very good about is if they read a story and get an idea from it, then you get thanked in the credits. You know, I mean, if you created the character, you obviously get thanked in the credits. But they're good about acknowledging where they got the ideas that they then run with. I mean, what they do with them is their own business, and they don't consult us writers from the original stuff. And I understand that. You don't want to be writing something and have people looking over your shoulder going, well, I would have, done it
right.
Yeah,
this other way. I mean, I can say I would have done Mantis another way, but that's because, that I wasn't looking over their shoulder. I was in the movies going, oh, what's this, Tim? So, yeah, I do think that they kind of hit Marvel fatigue wall in the last year, pushing out stuff too fast. And of course, the whole idea of the Marvel universe really fell apart with Disney Plus when they started saying, here, you want to do a character, go do whatever you want to do. Here, you want to do a character, go do whatever you want to do. And so you had this real mixed bag of things that didn't really, they varied in quality, certainly, but they also didn't really fit together to make anything. And I think they just sort of lost the plot, so to speak, at that point. I'm really hopeful that this long hiatus here now, that they're going back and rethinking that. But again, I'm not connected, so I'm just a fan in that regard, hoping that they will figure that out and get back to it.
So Steve, you mentioned your disagreements with how the portrayal of Mantis. Does the years that you worked on Mantis, does that make Mantis as a character mean a little more to you than like Star-Lord or Shang-Chi?
I like all my characters. I mean, I like comics. And so when you're writing, you're sitting alone in a room coming up with a story that you hope will entertain people. And if it's not entertaining you, I mean, as a professional writer, you can turn out an entertaining story without any personal interest in it. But I never really wanted to do that. I wanted to get involved in the stories that I was writing. So, you know, I can't say, oh, Doctor Strange was better or worse than Batman or Captain America or Shang-Chi or Star-Lord or any of those guys. I just, you know, any character that I wrote, I tried to do the best I could with that character. In the year 2001, Marvel owned and continues to own the Malibu characters, and there was a movement for a while to bring the Malibu characters into the universe, Marvel universe, which I thought would be fun. I thought it was kind of cool to take a group of people who had achieved stardom and celebrity in their own world and suddenly toss them into the Marvel universe where nobody knew who the fuck they were, and they didn't know that they were supposed to care about Spider-Man. You know, I mean, I thought that would be fun to play with. And in the end, it didn't happen. One of the reasons it didn't happen was by 2000, we had moved into the IP era of things. And so they said, well, you know, tell us what you're going to do for the first 12 issues of this book. And I'm like, I have no idea what I'm going to do for them, you know? And if I did, if I said, oh, okay, well, in issue 12, it's going to do this. Then a year later, I'd be sitting there like just checking off boxes. Like, I committed myself to do this, but it's a year later. I don't care. You know, it didn't develop organically. It's like, so we couldn't really come to a meeting of the minds on that sort of thing. But most of the time, I could just let that develop organically. You know, I mean, I kind of know that I want to go over here, and so we'll just sort of like roll with it to get there.
Steve, I got to ask this question. You work very closely with Neal Adams. Of course, he's a legend, the late legend, legendary Neal Adams. From your experience, though, what is Neal Adams' legacy on comics?
Well, I think he was, I thought when I went up and asked him if I could work with him, I thought he was the epitome. I thought there was nobody better than his photorealistic style and his technique. I mean, he knew he could draw anything. He understood everything. And so that, you know, who else would you want to work with? Well, I'm you know, it's hard to sort of put into words, but I mean, when he decided to have a studio with Dick Giordano, and then he sort of got other people working at the studio, and then he got other people to actually do a lot of the work, which then he would, you know, ink and fix up. I think he kind of got away from all the stuff that had really interested him, that had made him learn all that stuff. There were decades when there wasn't much Neal Adams work at all. But that being said, the stuff he did on Batman and Deadman and the X-Men and the Avengers and all that, it just was spectacularly good. And I don't think anybody's ever going to over time, people might notice that they didn't get a whole lot of Neal Adams in the 80s and 90s, but Neal Adams in the 60s and 70s was fabulous. It was so technically brilliant, but artistically brilliant. It's really a shame that he, and I wasn't there. I don't know the ins and outs of it as to why it appealed to him to be an overseer rather than an actual creator. Not going to change how great that stuff was that he did in comics. And before that, in the newspaper strip, I don't know if you guys have ever seen Ben Casey that he did.
Oh.
Ben Casey was a TV show, and he had a newspaper strip for 4 years before he went to work for DC. And that stuff is just as good. It's all just wonderful art. And in that case, he had to make the character look like the actor, right? Which Neal could do and did. But there's brilliant stuff in Ben Casey before he even got to, Batman and all that. In all honesty, I would say you can avoid the stuff that he did because he didn't do it in the 80s and 90s. But the stuff in the 60s and 70s is fantastic. And his Batman, before he did Batman per se, he did Brave and Bold with Batman. Dead Man is a wonderful strip. Any pure Neal Adams from the 60s and 70s. It's fabulous.
Speaking on his character, we heard that he had to testify for you for something, right?
He didn't have to, but he was just the nicest guy when I was working with him. Because it was one-on-one. He wasn't, he was my mentor in that sense, but he wasn't like my overseer or anything. I mean, we just, I say we worked together on the weekends for 6 months. Yeah. We worked on a Vampirella story, not starring Vampirella, but for the Vampirella book. And I mentioned that I got out of the Army. I got out of the Army because I applied for conscientious objection. I had been, I had no reason. I didn't really want to go in the Army, but I didn't really want to flee to Canada and do all that stuff. So I went in the Army and had some experiences that made me pretty clear that I wanted out of the Army. I never went to Vietnam. I never got over there, but talking to people who had been there, knowing people who did go and got killed, all that kind of stuff made an impression on my young mind. And so I applied for conscientious objection while in the Army. You had to be interviewed by a priest, you had to be interviewed by a psychiatrist, and you had to be interviewed by an officer. And when it came time for the interview with the officer, Neal said, I, on my own dime, will come down to Maryland, which is where I was stationed, and testify that you're a good guy. I mean, he didn't have to do that at all, first of all. And second of all, it wasn't, it was sort of up to me to convince the officer that I was a good guy. I was sincere about all this stuff, right? But Neal wanted to come down just because he did. He just wanted to come and say some nice things about him. That guy and the overseer guy are some distance apart, and I've never really understood exactly what it was, why he made the journey between the two. But when I was working with him, couldn't have had a nicer guy, or somebody who was more interested in my success and all that good stuff.
Wow. So Neal was one of the first guys to work on the official Marvel versus DC fights, Superman versus Amazing Spider-Man. But you, Steve, were the one to work on the unofficial Marvel DC crossover between Amazing Adventures, Justice League, and Thor. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, I would say Neal, just before we totally get past him, everybody knew he was like the guy, right? And so he did a lot of stuff for DC, but Marvel always was there too. And so if you're going to do a crossover, you get Neal. As far as our thing goes, the Rutland, Vermont had a Halloween parade every year. They, instead of trick-or-treating, maybe because the houses were far apart, it was cold, I don't really know. The guy who was in charge of Halloween festivities was a comic book fan, and so he encouraged the kids to wear comic book costumes for the Rutland Halloween parade. And a couple of guys in New York, Neal for one, Bernie Wrightson, Alan Weiss, heard about this and went up there and came back and said, it's really fun, what they're doing up there is really fun. So the next year, I wanted to go, Len Wein wanted to go, Jerry Conway wanted to go, Len's wife at the time wanted to go. And so we went. And we, drove up in my Mustang that I had. They didn't have cars. I was not from New York, so I had cars. we went up and had a really good time that weekend and came back and wanted to write a story about it. And I'm sure this is my idea because it's not the kind of thing that either Len or Jerry would have come up with. No offense to them, but it was just like, I'm like, why don't we do this story that involves all three of us? And but wait, because one of us doesn't work for Marvel, you know, how are you going to do that? And we just said, oh, let's figure it out. And so we did. And if you read those books, I forget the order in which you're supposed to read them now, but I mean, you can see Steve and Len and Jerry and Glennis, we wander into one of these books and we have an adventure, and then we wander out, and then you pick up the next book and we wander in, and, you know, and I'm pretty sure with the Beast and with Thor, we were able to make a few more connections. With the Justice League, it's just us again, you know, here we are in the car and with, you know, but and obviously I don't know what Len had to do with Julie Schwartz to get that approved. Over on our side, Jerry and I could do whatever we wanted to do, so that's what we did. It was just, you know, it was just fun. Like I keep saying about this, it was like, well, this would be cool, let's do this. Theoretically, it was possible for either Julie Schwartz at DC or for Roy at Marvel to go, no, you can't do this. But Roy's theory was, yeah, you can if it'll work. And I don't know, as I say, whatever happened with Julie, but nobody shut us down. So, you know, there we go.
Hey, it happened. It's the legend. Steve, you and legendary artist Marshall Rogers collaborated on some of the most classic Batman stories in Detective Comics. What inspired the Joker fish, and why do you think it's such a timeless gag?
Well, I had brought back the homicidal maniac Joker. He had been the homicidal maniac for the first 2 years, and then they got family friendly, and he wasn't a homicidal maniac anymore. He just did funny crimes. And we had that for 30 years. All the time I was reading Batman as a kid, that's the Joker that I saw. So I wanted to bring back this guy who was legitimately crazy and homicidal, and dark and weird. And in the end, when it came time for the big Joker finale, I just wanted to come up with something that you guys would say, that's nuts. But that the Joker could plausibly think, no, this is a really cool idea. I like this idea. And somehow that became the laughing fish. I mean, you know, why it's the laughing fish and not the singing kookaburras or whatever, I couldn't tell you, but fish were funny. You know, laughing goes along with the Joker. I mean, I that's about the best I can do for that. But just the fact that he's so committed to these fish with their Joker faces, I thought people could go, yeah, this guy's nuts. He is nuts. He's not just a funny guy pulling off weird bank robberies. He's actually nuts. And so, you know, we went there. And I just, as far as the whole thing went, there were circumstances about how I was having to write it. I was leaving to go to Europe. I didn't have an infinite amount of time, whatever. But Batman was always my favorite character. Again, in the 50s, there weren't many characters that you could actually, so Batman was my favorite of them, but it did have the weird Dick Sprang art with the extreme perspectives and all this kind of stuff. And that's part of why I wanted to be an artist. I really, I liked comic book art as done by Dick Sprang, certainly. When I got my chance to do the Batman, I wanted to do the best Batman I could. I wanted to do some legendary, memorable thing, which is kind of a cool thing to think, but then you either do it or you don't, Sometimes even when you are planning and working to do the best possible thing ever, it doesn't always work out the way that you thought it would. With Batman, certainly I felt like this really, I got the spirit of it, I got the characters, I got the story with Silver St. Cloud and Bruce Wayne, I got, all she recognizes his chin. I mean, all the stuff that I thought really made for a good story. but I didn't know who was going to draw it. It had started obviously with Walt Simonson and Al Milgrom, and Simonson was just doing layouts, and Milgrom is kind of a loose inker, so it was coming out as not particularly intense, shall we say. I like both of those guys. I've worked with both of those guys. You know, I mean, it's like but the way the book was being done, it wasn't getting the darkness and the intensity that I was looking for. Nevertheless, in those days, you didn't go to your editor and say, I want somebody else to draw this book, because everything was assigned, right? I mean, you didn't get your buddy and go to the editor. Well, Starlin and I did on Master of Kung Fu, but that was really a one-off. I mean, as a general rule, I mean, you didn't, and so I didn't tell Julie Schwartz I wanted a different artist, but Julie must have come to the same opinion. Julie was a very good editor, and he really understood comics. He must have come to the same conclusion, and somehow or other, he made his decision. Anyway, I went to Europe. I wrote all my scripts and left the country. And it wasn't until like 6 months later that I got this package from Julie, which had all the issues in it. And I saw Marshall Rogers and Terry Austin art for the first time. And I seriously, I'm not traditionally religious, but I sincerely said, thank you, God, when I looked at this, because it was perfect for what I was hoping we would get out of it. And as it turns out, Marshall and Terry were also huge Batman people who wanted to do the best Batman they could. But there was no guarantee that that would happen. I mean, most of the people left working at DC were, journeyman people. A lot of the DC stars had gone to Marvel by this time. And so the odds were that it was just going to be drawn by a couple of competent, people making their rent money. And I've always said, I mean, that, if it had been, the scripts were the scripts, but if they'd been drawn by lesser artists, you would think that the overall story was less than it was, right? But everything that I wanted out of it got enhanced and polished up and everything by Marshall and Terry. So in the end, everybody, through circumstance as much as anything else, but everybody got there. And so that run, is now a thing,
It's legendary.
Yeah, it's legendary.
It is. Steve, in one way or another, your work has impacted the comic book industry for well over 50 years. Is there anything about how you were taught to make comics that is lost today?
Oh, well, the spontaneity. I mean, I'm not involved in comics today, so I can't exactly say, oh, they're doing this and we did this. But I mean, the continuity's gone, certainly. The spontaneity is had a big hit. I mean, I'm sure that if you started comics and they say from the start, you're going to have to tell us what you're doing in issue 12, you adapt to that, right? I mean, you work with that and go from there. So, there have been plenty of good writers and artists and comics that have come out in the last 20 years when I have not been involved in it. But I think the whole thing, I mean, that whole thing about the Marvel bullpen was legit. That's what it was. It was a group of people sitting around doing comics and talking to each other and hanging out and sometimes going up on the roof to smoke a little weed. I mean, it's like, not everybody, certainly, but it was just people having fun doing stuff. And now I think there is a lot more structure, a lot more editorial involvement, and IP involvement. I mean, nobody's going to walk up to somebody today and say, "Here, Captain America, do whatever you want to do." It's like, no, that's not going to happen. It was, so stuff has definitely been lost, right? But I can't exactly say how it got replaced or what's taking its place now.
Would you want to do like write a new story today, like whether it be like a miniseries or ongoing?
I used to say that if Marvel would let me do it my way, I mean, with no editorial oversight, that I could see it. But they've talked to me now a couple times at the last couple cons I've been to. They've got a thing going on where they get people to come back and do stuff. Daniel Chichester doing Daredevil, or Ann Nocenti doing Ms. Marvel, or whichever Captain Marvel, whichever she is these days. I'm basically not interested in that. If I were to write, for example, a Captain America story today, I would have to reimagine him for today, because he's a character that exists, in my mind at least, he exists in the America that we're all living in. So I would have to come up with, a new version of it, in which case, why get me to do it? I mean, let somebody else do their take on Captain America. And if I came back and wrote the 70s Captain America, he would be a fish out of water. It wouldn't make any sense. I did tell him, as I mentioned earlier, that they own all the Malibu characters, and they don't do the Malibu characters because our contracts say that we get a little percentage of the money, and they don't want to open that can of worms. But I did say to them, if you really want me to come back, I'll do it if I can do Nightman. I would write Nightman for you. And there's been nothing but silence to that. I would choose Nightman not just because it would pry it loose from their drawer, but because it got cut off, and I didn't. We had all these ideas about things we were going to do with Nightman, and it didn't. We didn't get to do it. I've had a lot of series that have been cut off for one reason or another, but Nightman, I would love to see return, to visibility. So I made him an offer. It's like, yeah, if you want me to come back, I'll do the character that you don't want to do. and we'll, maybe that would work, or maybe it wouldn't, and it doesn't seem like it did. Because I believe characters are alive in that sense. I mean, Captain America or anybody that I did, I would have to kind of like rethink it as to who it is now. Other people can do that. So why I can't do the 70s version of the characters, and other people would be doing the 20s version of the characters. So no, it doesn't really interest me. I still write. I'm still doing stuff, and hopefully long term, I might start up some sort of independent thing, or do it for Image or IDW or whatever. Because I like writing, and I do like writing, but I don't want to go back, and I just don't want to do it.
Steve, thank you for joining us. It's such an honor to have you. Is there anything that we haven't discussed that you would like to talk about?
When I got started in comics, Dick Giordano was another one of my mentors. He was, we lived near each other in Connecticut, and I would go hang out with him, when I wasn't in the city. And he said to me once, he was glad that his day job was as an inker because, every writer he ever knew burnt out. At which point, since I was a young writer, I said, I don't want to do that. So I kept an eye on myself. And I mean, the thing that I really loved about comics was coming up with a new story about these characters every week. But after a while, coming up with a new story every week can get to be tedious in the work sense, right? And when I got to the point where I was like, this is becoming not so much fun anymore, I would leave. I would go do something else. And so I ended up being a game designer at Atari. I worked at Sega. I worked at Broderbund. I did video games for them. Over the years, I did some animation work. I did live action stuff when Nightman became a TV show. And there was a period in the late 80s. I had kids in the 80s, 83 and 86. And so in the late 80s, I was interested in doing stuff for kids. And so I ended up doing books for Avon for young adult stuff. And through one of the books turned out to be, I just did the history of the Wright brothers for kids. And NASA chose it from among all the books for young adults about the Wright brothers and made it part of their school curriculum that they would, provide to schools and so on and so forth. Again, sort of out of the blue, not expected, but Wright brothers story is a pretty interesting story, actually, and so I had a good time telling it. That's where I come out on that.
Steve, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a great interview, such insight. You're always welcome to come back. Mark, I want to thank you for arranging this, because this is a big interview for us. So, all right, well, that's all for our show. If you like what you see, please subscribe and hit the like button. This is 6 Layers. I'm Mike, speaking for Mark and Steve Englehart. We are out. Peace.
6 Layers.